yeah, I was really happy that we got to do this.
Brilliant. Well, hi, everyone, wherever you are in the world, whether you're joining us on Facebook or on YouTube or watching this again on Instagram, welcome. My name's Dru. I'm one of the co-founders of Club Soda. Club Soda is a movement that exists to help you be more mindful about drinking so that you can live well. And we offer that through helping you choose better low and no alcohol drinks, supporting you to change your drinking and making the connections for you that will help you grow. And one of the things that we love doing in Club Soda is introducing you to others in the world of sobriety and mindful drinking who are making waves. And one of those people is Ruby Warrington. Thanks for joining us, Ruby.
Thanks for having me, Dru. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. So for those of you who've been around Club Soda for a while, if you come to our festivals before, or if you've read Quitlet, you may have come across Ruby's name. She's the author of Sober Curious. Really brought that concept to the fore. And I wonder if could we start there, Ruby? Could we start there by you introducing yourself and telling us a bit about what you think sober curiosity is?
Sure. So yeah, I'm British by birth and I'm currently based in New York. I've been here in the States for almost 9 years now. And my move here actually coincided with me beginning to really question my drinking. And I was just really aware that although alcohol was something I perceived as very pleasurable and my fast track to fun in my life, and definitely it was something that my whole social group revolved around. Everybody drank excessively, but no one seemed to have a quote unquote problem with drinking. But I became aware that actually my alcohol consumption was having more of a negative impact on my overall well-being than it was worth it, I suppose. It was like than I was willing to accept anymore, I suppose. I never had a horrible rock bottom, like never used to black out, never had any of those kind of situations that we associate with severe problem drinking. So didn't think that recovery or alcohol addiction applied to me in my drinking. Although looking back now, I've got a lot to say about that. What we perceive as problem drinking and what we think of as normal drinking and why that is. But it was around the time that I moved to New York actually gave me this real kind of natural break point in my life in terms of the social life that I was leading anyway. And I started introducing myself to lots of different people, socializing in lots of different ways. And this gave me some space and some perspective to really start to question my drinking. And these questions were everything from like, why do I often drink when I don't want to? Why do I feel the need to drink in certain situations? Why do other people expect me to drink in certain situations? Does the fact I'm asking these questions mean I do actually have a drinking problem, even though I don't look like I have a drinking problem? And over time, over the years, really, I began to call this being sober curious. Because I gradually was drinking less and less and less over this period, taking longer and longer breaks, largely just to kind of like test my theories. Is life better without alcohol? Well, I'm not going to know unless I stop. If I stop for a month, okay, what happens if I stop for 6 months? And just really kind of doing these thought experiments around alcohol, I suppose. And yeah, this was what I came to term sober curious, because like I said, I didn't see myself as sober, because I also respected that within recovery communities, people had, rightly so, very much prized their sobriety, and I didn't want to take that terminology in vain. So I came up with this term sober curious because I was really curious about everything to do with my relationship to alcohol, but then in a broader way I was starting to get really curious about how we as a society drink and the role that alcohol plays in all of our lives. And so, yeah, that's where the term came from. And then I started hosting events in New York about almost 5 years ago, which at the time were called Club Soda. Before I knew about you guys.
This is how we know each other.
This is kind of how we know each other. I just thought it was so genius. And I was like, oh, so did some other people apparently. But I felt really called to start speaking up about this because my sober curiosity had unveiled so many strange paradoxes and untruths and murky kind of areas that there weren't any really clear answers around things like, for example, what is problem drinking? It's such a huge question when we really start to unpack it. And so I started hosting these events on this subject matter, and they just kind of got bigger and bigger. And it seemed like, well, there's lots of people who are asking these same questions. underneath the surface of all this like quote unquote fun social drinking that's happening, a lot of people are questioning their drinking. And that became a book, which was actually my second book. I had another book out before that, which came out 2 years ago this month. And since that, in the past 2 years, I think that term sober curious, it's obviously just really, really taken off.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what it did, it gave a language to, like I said, this kind of very internal questioning that had been happening and that was happening in different pockets here and there, like within your organization, within, you know, the conversation around books like This Naked Mind, etc. And hip sobriety. But there was the sober curious just seemed to be a really nice handy catch like term that people across the board could apply to this sort of questioning or reevaluating of our relationships with alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really valuable attitude to bring to the process of change anyway, you know, to be curious about your own experience, to stand back from it a little, to see it for what it is, and to ask questions of yourself, which help you develop and grow. Talking of questions, if you're watching live and you've got questions that you want me to put to Ruby, please do share them in the comments. We'll weave them into the conversation. We won't use your name, so you don't need to worry about that if you're in our Facebook group. But yeah, if you've got something you want Ruby to speak to, please do comment, and we will get to all of those things. Ruby, I wanted to ask you one of the concepts that you mention in your book, which I quite like, was FOMA, fear of missing alcohol. And you know, particularly at this time of year, as we're approaching Christmas, and drinking gets so woven into our attitudes to celebration and to gathering people together. And, you know, wherever you are in the world, you know, whether you can safely do that or not with the pandemic that's going on, it's likely that alcohol is going to be top of mind for people when they're approaching the Christmas period. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, about what you mean by, I guess, fear of missing alcohol, but also kind of what that might mean for somebody coming up to Christmas celebrations.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge question. I'm really happy to be sort of speaking about this at this time of year, because I think it's one of the most challenging times of year. It's so interesting. Another paradox, right? We think about this as the season of good cheer and happiness and cozy family meals. And yet we also know that this is a time when depression and anxiety spike. And that, on a really serious note, suicide spikes. And it's obviously actually quite a traumatic time of year for people. Often we don't all come from the kind of cozy family backgrounds that we see on Christmas cards, and that alone can sort of trigger lots of deep feelings around fitting in and our role in the world and our relationships and all sorts of things. So naturally along comes alcohol to just kind of smooth over a lot of that, often under the guise of, again, like celebrating and having more fun. And so I think this can actually be a really, really powerful time of year to step back from the drinking culture. FOMA that you mentioned, fear of missing alcohol, is just all of the fear that comes up when we consider engaging in any kind of activities where we would normally be drinking without a drink. We can feel, even saying it now, I'm like, that feels naked. It feels super vulnerable. It feels like very exposing, and just like, how am I even going to cope in this situation? And that fear actually is one of the clues as to why confronting your FOMA can be so powerful, because actually often it's when we confront our deepest fears that we realize. I remember I was listening to an audiobook, a guy called Mishka Shubali. He wrote a book called Cold Turkey Sobriety, and it's all about kind of quitting without a program and just kind of other ways that you can approach it. And he in that talks about how in life our fears about a situation are always worse than actually being in the situation. Like the way we think, how bad we think something's going to be is always worse than when we're actually grappling with it. And I think that's absolutely true to what I also call sober firsts. Anytime you do something sober for the first time that you've usually used alcohol for, it can be petrifying, but coming through it and actually confronting it is so incredibly empowering. You invariably come out the other side just feeling like a complete superhero, because you've confronted this thing you were very afraid of and proven to yourself that you're stronger than that fear, that you actually you didn't need alcohol. Maybe it was really uncomfortable. Maybe you were literally sitting on your hands, like counting the minutes until you could leave. but you got through it, you woke up the next day without a hangover, and you can look at yourself in the eye in the mirror and say, you are amazing, you're officially amazing. And it's really motivating to confront those situations. So I think, coming through, as in America, you know, the holiday season, which begins with Thanksgiving, or actually it kind of begins with Halloween, then we have Thanksgiving, then Christmas, and then New Year. It's like this 2 months where there are so many opportunities and expectations, more so even, to drink. So quitting at this point, or being sober curious at this point, and actually engaging with some of that without a drink in your hand, is extremely powerful for anyone looking to change their habits in the long term. These are the kinds of experiences that very rapidly start to rewire our habitual impulses around drinking, which is essentially what we're seeking to do when we question it.
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly this time of year, you know, we actually run a program in Club Soda called Christmas with Club Soda, which, by the way, for anyone who's watching, is still open if you want to sign up if you're thinking about the Christmas period. But actually, the majority of the people on that course are people who have quit drinking a while ago, or they've cut down a while ago. They've been going at this for some time, but then Christmas comes up, and it feels like a big enough deal that you need to deal with it. So yeah, if you're sitting watching this and thinking, I'll leave it till the new year, I'd encourage you not to. You know, grasp the nettle now. You know, and as you say, you know, those you can knock off some of those big things that worry people about how am I going to do Christmas Day, what am I going to do about seeing my family, how am I going to celebrate New Year if I don't have a glass of champagne, whatever all those things are. You find ways, and you're absolutely right. I think one of the other things that always strikes me that those of us who kind of wrestle with drinking, that we share in common, is that we can very often be perfectionists. We're very all or nothing in our thinking, and we can catastrophize things in advance terribly. And genuinely, I've never yet been in a life situation that has been 100% perfect or 100% terrible. Most stuff is somewhere in between most of the time, and that's exactly the right attitude to have, isn't it? To be curious about those experiences before you get to them. Exactly.
And I love that phrase you used, grasp the nettle. It comes from, right? Because if you grasp a nettle, it doesn't sting you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's only when you brush up against it. So the more all in you go with conviction, the less likely you're going to get stung and come away with a nasty rash. I love that you use that. It's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question for you. We have a view on this in Club Soda, by the way, about the role that alcohol-free drinks can play and how they can be useful in supporting people to find alternatives and make change. But a question from somebody who says that they've been sober for 6 months and they're doing well, but they're wondering what your views are on alcohol-free drinks. And do you think that drinking alcohol-free beer or wine can lead you back to drinking the real stuff? I want to put quotes around the real stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Again,
there's so much terminology and language that we just use without thinking, right? And we can question all of that. Okay, so I'm going to speak from my personal experience. For me personally, and this is speaking as somebody who, on the scale, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10 of addiction to alcohol, I would probably put myself at about a 5 in my kind of height of my drinking days, maybe a 5 veering to a 6. These drinks have been extremely helpful for me. For me, they're just, there's the placebo effect of having something that looks and tastes a bit like the thing I was expecting, that tricks my brain for long enough, that the craving kind of goes away, the craving for the alcohol part goes away. I have an alcohol-free beer most nights. For me, it's just a really good signal of like the end of the day. I also just really enjoy the taste of beer. You know, I'd find it uniquely refreshing. I don't want a kombucha. I don't want a Coke. I don't want something sweet. And I don't just want water. And for me, beer is in the middle. There's actually something great in the States called hoppy water. Have you had hoppy water?
No, I haven't come across
water brewed with like water with hops brewed into it. So it tastes like an IPA, but it's just water. It's amazing. So for me personally, they've been really helpful. Now, my partner is in the 12-step recovery program, and he is much more cautious about what he indulges in, let's say. He will sample things, and I think actually a lot of his fear around it, or his trepidation, is because that within 12-step recovery these things are regarded as not a good idea. And I think that he's got additional kind of caution around it because that's the messaging he's receiving there. But I think perhaps if you're earlier, perhaps if it's only 6 months in, some of the things that are more kind of quote unquote realistic realistic. Like the original, like alcoholic version might not be such a good idea. Maybe some of the more kind of alcohol-free alternatives, like a seedlip, which doesn't actually taste like gin, but gives you the impression of having like a more sophisticated drink, could be a good idea, versus having like some alcohol-free wine that kind of tastes an awful lot like the real thing. Yeah. But I think for me as well, I kind of realized that actually a lot of the time my cravings were for something delicious and grown up to drink. Yeah, and actually I didn't miss the psychosomatic effect. I didn't miss the getting out of it. I was actually quite happy just to have the drinking it part.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the core message that we have in Club Soda, is that actually whatever you're drinking, let it be something that you enjoy. You know, don't if you feel like you are depriving yourself at any point, you're more likely to be digging into willpower as a way of change, and that ultimately is exhausting. You know, it's a really miserable way to change if you're not seeking pleasure. And so, you know, whether it works for you or not, again, it's about curiosity, isn't it? It's about experimenting and seeing what works for you. We'll come on to some more questions, but I've realized that we've got 15 minutes into this conversation, and we haven't mentioned the fact that you've got a new book out. Yes. So your new book is called The Sober Curious Reset. It's got your subtitle makes quite a promise. Change the way you drink in 100 days or less. That's quite a bold promise, and I wonder, could you tell us how the book lives up to that?
Okay, so the Sober Curious Reset, it basically guides you through 100 days of not drinking. We're really familiar now with initiatives like Dry January, Sober October, Sober September, which should, you know, advise a month off. And I think a month off drinking could be a great detox. It can be a great, if not a full stop, a semicolon you're drinking, right? It can definitely give you pause for thought. Extending that to 100 days makes a huge amount of difference. That's actually a really substantial amount of time. It's a whole season out of a year. You mentioned willpower. I think most people can get through a month of drinking on willpower alone. You just kind of grit your teeth, knuckle down, and you get through it, and you've got your eye on the prize, which is the end of the month. 100 days of willpower, you're going to get tired really, really quickly. You've sort of got no choice but to just kind of relax into it and start to take each day as it comes, which I think is the key piece when it comes to making sustainable change. I was talking to someone about this the other day, and I realized that if you're approaching your drinking kind of one day at a time, like literally with the, you know, am I going to drink today? Do I want to drink today? And really kind of asking yourself, like, why, if you think it's a yes, then okay, is that really a good idea? Well, maybe no, so I'm not going to drink today. If you're engaging in that kind of conversation with yourself every day, you're proactively choosing every day something that's good for you. You're proactively choosing not to drink every day versus like denying yourself something every day. Like, which would you rather be engaged with? And I think proactively choosing not to drink for 100 days, there's no, it's almost like that saying, you know, there's no kind of, you can't close that door. Once you've been through 100 days of actively choosing not to drink, you can't unsee what we've learned about yourself during that period, because not only is it 100 days, so it's this longer, prolonged period of time where you're going to have to, there are going to be some sober firsts, even in lockdown, even under COVID, there are going to be some sober firsts in 100 days, meaning, you know, first family gathering, first date, first party, or like first work do, whatever it is, first Friday night on your own. But then each day of content has a different question for you to consider, and then an exercise, like an interactive exercise for you to engage with. So there's lots of journaling exercises, there's some sort of guided meditations, there's some sort of thought experiments where I ask you to question certain different aspects of our drinking culture. So I think the combination of the time scale of 100 days plus this very specific sort of little experiment for you to do every day with yourself. I don't promise you'll stop drinking. I do promise you will change the way you drink. Yeah. And I think the book will live up to its promise, because like I said, I think there's things you'll discover about yourself through actually engaging with this work that will make it very difficult for you to go back to drinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what
drinking unconsciously, back to drinking kind of
Yeah.
without knowing in every instant why you're doing it. And as long as
Yeah.
once you know why you're doing it, you can begin to change, because only when you know why can you really get to a good, sustainable why I'm not. And when you get to a why, you can also work out, well, I'm using it for this, so what else can I do to get this that's not drinking alcohol?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether you listen to it, but there's a great podcast from the New York Times, Modern Love.
I haven't listened to it.
It's fabulous. These little people write little essays about their relationships and then talk about them. And there was one about 6 weeks ago, which was all about somebody who was drinking, but had a partner on the other side of the country. And so when they were apart, she drank. When they were together, because her partner was sober, she didn't drink. And she suddenly realized this kind of degree of denial that she was in, keeping these two parts of her life separate. Anyway, she used this really lovely phrase in her essay, and I've started using it myself, which is that honesty is linear. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. And I think that is right. If you go through a process of self-discovery over the course of 100 days, if you're asking yourself questions, you are going to know things at the end of that process, aren't you, that are going to change you, which you can't unknow.
You can't unknow. You can't lie to yourself about what you've discovered or what you've uncovered. About the Modern Love, I actually submitted an essay to Modern Love a couple of years ago, and it was about breaking up with alcohol. It was about my love affair with alcohol. Yep. Didn't get selected, sadly, but
It's a great podcast. I recommend it to anyone. It's brilliant. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions which I wanted to get your thoughts on. So this is from somebody. They've been sober for a year, and they don't feel that they want to drink, but they say right now they feel a bit of a fraud because they haven't been out to any social events which involve alcohol this year. That's a really remarkably common experience, by the way, to have kind of got your drinking under control during lockdown and to be thinking about socializing afterwards. And they're saying that they think fear of missing alcohol may get in what may become real for them when everything opens back up. For anyone who's changed their drinking during this period of lockdown and restriction, and particularly, for those of us who are social drinkers, actually, pubs and bars and restaurants closing, it's been horrible for the hospitality industry and for workers in that industry, but might have given us a break. I wonder what your kind of thoughts are about, as the world reopens, we'll hope that it does, but as the world reopens, how you can maintain some of those good habits going forward.
Well, having a year of not drinking under your belt has already created such new neural pathways in your brain around drinking. But yes, absolutely, I'm sure it will be very triggering once the situations where you normally were drinking kind of come back onto the social calendar. And again, my advice would be, don't shy away from them. It might feel frightening to kind of like put yourself in that situation, but there are all sorts of ways that you can kind of arm yourself ahead of time to set yourself up for success, I suppose. One of my favorite things, and it comes quite early in the Sober Curious reset, is just to list down sort of like 5 of your top reasons for not drinking. And they can be anything, and they're going to be very personal to you. Like, what are the 5 main reasons? And try and keep them in the positive as well. Like, I want more of this. I'm excited about this. I value this about myself and my life. I want more friendships that look like this, these kinds of things. And just kind of keep that somewhere that you can refer to it, whether it's on the notes app in your phone, or even, if you have a physical diary, you could write it in there, put it on a Post-it on your fridge or something. And just kind of look at it fairly often to remind yourself of why you're doing this for yourself. So that in the face of, and it's probably at this stage less likely to be temptation about drinking, it will probably be more social, like peer pressure that you're confronted with. Just to really remind yourself like why you're doing this and why you're committed to this. Is a good, just a kind of mindset trick to have kind of in your back pocket, literally.
Yeah, I think one of the other things when we're approaching social situations, and particularly if you're somebody who's stopped drinking, so much of our language about changing our drinking is negative. We stop things and we quit things and we give things up. We don't talk about positive choices, and that actually begins to affect how we talk to other people about it. So we think that when somebody offers us a drink, our gut response is that we should say no, but we forget that when somebody offers us a drink, actually what they're saying is, your presence here is important to me and I want you to feel included. And we can answer that question positively. You know, if somebody offers you a drink, you can say, yes, I'd love a drink. Have you got something that's alcohol free? You know, you can make that a positive statement rather than feeling like it's a negative or a challenge that you have to overcome. It just takes a little bit of planning and thought in advance.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the important thing to remember as well is, like, alcohol's not going anywhere, and it's going to be a pretty miserable existence if not drinking means kind of locking yourself away in a cage and just pretending that alcohol doesn't exist. And the whole point, you know, the whole point really with getting one of the things about Sober Curious is not like, it's not about labeling alcohol and drinking as good or bad. It's just about staying so solid in your own experience and your own reasons for making the choices that you are, that you become impervious to the extreme pressure, because there's extreme pressure from our friends, from society, from the advertising industry. There's extreme pressure to drink all the time. So our work is to get so solid in ourselves that that sort of starts to bounce off us and we become impervious to it, because it's not going anywhere. And I agree with you, Dru. Like, I think that the lockdowns for people who are maybe a bit more introverted, and I definitely relate to this, like, as somebody who used alcohol to boost my self-esteem in social situations, it's been an absolute relief not to kind of have that, not only to not have the pressure to drink, but just to not have the pressure to socialize, and just to be much more kind of considered and one-on-one about the social situations I've been in. And I think that, great, okay, so maybe I'll continue that post-lockdown. And it doesn't mean bad or boring. It just means that I prefer socializing one-to-one during the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are many, many ways to connect with people that don't involve sitting in a pub and having a drink with them. Another question, which is actually an altogether more serious issue. Somebody sharing that they recently had what sounds like a very serious car accident. They're currently off work. They've been sober for 2 years, but tempted to drink right now, and worried that that might just be a coping mechanism. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how to approach that situation.
It sounds like it absolutely could be. I think that anytime we have any kind of a traumatic life event, alcohol is a very readily available, easy to administer, swift working anesthetic, physically and emotionally. And it would make absolute sense when you've been through something traumatic to be, for your brain is looking for ways to kind of like, how can I make myself feel better? Whether you're in physical pain or you're just feeling, you know, traumatized from it still. So first of all, don't feel like you're weak or like there's anything wrong with you if you're craving alcohol in that situation. It sounds like it would be very natural, especially if it's something that you found relief through using before. I suppose some techniques might be just sort of looking at mindfulness techniques or kind of meditation techniques, depending on how physically, you know, active you're able to be. Maybe some sort of very gentle yoga, like yin yoga or yoga nidra. These are techniques that can really help to fully relax the body and bring about a state of very kind of like calm relaxation in the body. But again, I think in any situation, it might seem like the obvious, why am I wanting a drink, is because you've just been through this traumatic event. But how about narrowing it down and really drilling down into, what do I actually really need in this moment?
Yeah.
Do I need to speak to someone about what happened? Do I need to feel physically more relaxed? Do I need, you know, to feel like I'm definitely going to get a good sleep tonight? And there are all sorts of, there's, you know, it's all sorts of stuff. We just Google like sleep hygiene, all sorts of ways that you can like guide yourself towards getting a better night's sleep. So yeah, I think just number one, be really kind to yourself if your cravings come back. And number two, just really think about what do I actually physically need right now? What do I emotionally need right now? And what are some of the ways that I could look for that?
Yeah, I think that's very sound advice. You mentioned a little bit about yoga and mindfulness, which leads me on to the other subject that I wanted to talk to you about. So quite aside from your writing of your new book, and just a reminder that's the Sober Curious Reset. Quite aside from that, you also run a thing called the Numinous, and I wonder if you could tell us, what is that thing that the other thing that you do?
So the Numinous is a platform I launched in 2012 that back in the day was more of a kind of online magazine, before we had social media, and that basically took away all the need for any other kind of media. Whole other subject. So in it, the Numinous sought to really introduce lots of these kind of far out, kind of more woo-woo mystical concepts, I suppose, to an audience in a way that made them very accessible, very kind of appealing and fun and attractive, kind of elements of our, to bring to our busy kind of hectic working online lives, to help us feel more grounded and to help us feel more human and to help us connect to the people that we are on the inside. And so it covers everything from, astrology and tarot through yoga, meditation, all sorts of things around energy work, but also personal development on the more kind of emotional, spiritual side. So that's Numinous. And I relaunched it this year as Numinous Books. So it kind of has I've launched my own books in that subject area. Then it had a big kind of Instagram phase. And now I've launched, sort of steered it towards this Numinous publishing imprint. And I'm working with authors to self-publish their books that largely kind of broadly fall into this subject matter with the Numinous. But for me, and it was interesting when I first pitched the idea for Sober Curious, I was still very much in the Numinous world. And I remember thinking, wow, people are going to think this is such a massive leap from all of this kind of spiritual stuff to sobriety. For me, the two are completely interwoven. And it very much coincided, me getting Sober Curious, with launching the Numinous and really starting to use these different tools and practices, some of which I mentioned, to do a much kind of like deeper investigation of like who I really am, what I need on an emotional level, where there was a spiritual hole in my life. And through those investigations, it really shone a very harsh light on how I was using alcohol in a lot of those situations to seek some of those answers. I was using alcohol to feel more connected to something bigger than me. I was using alcohol to numb some of the kind of emotional, traumatic stuff that I hadn't ever really looked at, that was now ready to be looked at. So for me, getting Sober Curious, and I talk about this on that platform, it's the biggest tool in my spiritual toolbox, because actually removing alcohol has been like the number one way of coming into closer connection to myself and really understanding who I am, what my life is all about, like what I want to create and contribute in the world. So yeah, there's a huge crossover for me personally between those two worlds.
I wonder, so in Club Soda's courses, we encourage people on our longer courses, either how to drink mindfully or how to drink mindfully AF, we encourage people to take up a formal mindfulness practice. There's actually the research evidence from behavior change science suggests that an ongoing formal mindfulness practice can prevent relapse. If you're somebody who is going alcohol free in the long term or significantly reducing alcohol in the long term, actually the practice of being aware every day, of being in touch with your emotional well-being, of just observing the fact that you think things, that you feel things, that you experience things, and learning to put that breathing space between external stimulus and your response to it, all of that can help you maintain your well-being in the long term. I wonder, do you think that there are, I'm just interested in the fact that there's a certain portion of the population which kind of views these two subjects as completely distinct. And we in Club Soda, our approach to behavior change and our approach to mindfulness is completely secular. So you don't need to believe or think anything to do one of our courses. But equally, there are people in the kind of the mindfulness well-being, the numinous world, is for whom alcohol is something that gets taken completely for granted, as if it doesn't relate to those things at all. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts about why it might be that we kind of keep those two subjects so distant from each other, and how we might bring them together.
Well, I think they're both subjects that are very heavily stigmatized. So people have a lot of assumptions and opinions about these two different areas, whether it's sort of personal development, spirituality, and alcohol and drinking, or even addiction. So people have very strong opinions that are very black and white around these two different areas, I suppose. And if you're fully bought into one thing, but you have, for whatever reason, a very clear-cut idea about what kinds of person engages in these other activities, it can be quite hard. It can take some real time to kind of break that down. But like I said, for me, they're completely interwoven. Although it's something that's very interesting is that in the kind of numinous community, there are definitely some people who would see alcohol as like, you know, a way to kind of open up, to receive more spiritual messages and that kind of thing. And I actually have an episode of my podcast coming up about that. And even, you know, Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, and Carl Jung, the kind of godfather of modern psychology, had conversations about this, how the urge to drink was a spiritual urge. It was coming from a desire to connect to something like a greater experience of life, to experience something that goes beyond, you know, our kind of three-dimensional material existence. And that people often were using alcohol as a way to tap into this numinous realm. And that therefore, if you had alcohol problems, it was a spiritual problem. And actually what needed to be addressed was like where this yearning or this kind of like deep sense of unfulfillment was actually coming from in your life. And so often those have a really deep emotional root, which we can actually only access through doing more sort of numinous kind of, what, you know, in the UK would be called like touchy-feely sort of self-work, you know. I've got an episode of my podcast coming up with a hypnotherapist who talks about self-hypnosis as a really great way to, you know, get into your deep subconscious mind and actually start to look at where some of your habitual patterns are coming from. So yeah, I think the divide between those two worlds comes from stigma that's attached to both of them. And it's interesting, when you were describing mindfulness, I was like, that's essentially what being sober curious is. It's about adopting a mindful approach to your drinking, meaning an observer's mind, which we develop through meditation. And meditation has, again, so much stigma. We have such high, strong ideas about the kind of people that do meditation. Meditation is something we can all do naturally, and it's a practice that we can engage in, which actually helps us to separate from our thoughts, so we can become this observer self, and we can observe the choices we're making, we can observe what we're thinking without feeling caught up in it all. That's a very powerful place to be. And then the question becomes, well, who's observing? Who's observing? If I believe that I am my thoughts, I am my cravings, I am my attachments, I am my beliefs, and then I'm able to actually start to observe some of that stuff going on, and I'm able to observe the choices and the behaviors I'm making, who is observing? And that for me is the really interesting question.
Yes.
And that's what in some circles might be called the higher self, or the cosmic self, or the universal self, you know?
Maybe a little beyond the scope of this interview. But I think genuinely fascinating, because I think very often, so I guess my fundamental thinking on all of this is that if it helps you change, embrace it, you know, regardless of what discipline or psychological theory it comes from, or what tradition or whatever it is. If you find something that supports you to develop your autonomy, to become a fully functioning, happy human being, that's a thing that's worth embracing. And I think you're right to highlight some of the stigma around some of these things. You know, I find myself saying, you know, when I kind of introduce the subject of meditation, you know, you don't need a pair of yoga pants or a scented candle. You just need to be able to sit down. You know, this is all that we're doing. If you can't sit down, you can do this standing up or lying down. Doesn't really matter, you know. But I feel the need to kind of destigmatize it for people, to make it kind of more palatable and acceptable for people who think it's something kind of strange or different. And very often it's not, is it? And all these things, you're right, I think they do weave together. You know, whether we're being able to take that step back as the observing self to see our actions, whether that's in the context of how do I feel about life, or how do I feel about having this pint, you know, it's the same skill set at work, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think, you know, without getting too kind of like out there, I just think when it comes to so many of our experiences of spirituality come with a lot of religious dogma attached, and a lot of that religious dogma is very moralistic, and it labels a lot of stuff good or bad, and it dictates that behaving in certain ways is going to condemn us to hell, literally. And I think that we naturally have a lot of fear, therefore, when approaching any kind of subject that touches on spirituality, because it can bring up all of this, like, do I have to be a good person to do this? what does being a good person even look like? And if you're someone who's done a lot of heavy drinking, there are probably things in your past that you regret when you did not feel like such a good person. And I think a lot of this is about saying, that's okay. But let's just remove that sort of moralizing around it and actually just look at what the bare bones are, like the actual reality of what's happening here.
Yeah.
If it's good or bad. And no matter at what point we decide to intervene and start to make a change, that's okay too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly if you've struggled with drinking for a while, if you've been really in the depths and you've been wrestling with it, you can carry around the sense of moral failure, as if there is something fundamentally flawed and broken about you. And actually recovering a sense of agency, however you do that, you know, understanding that you can make good choices, you know, you can take steps in the right direction. You know, I say to people, you know, one drink less is a win. You know, take the small wins. You know, this isn't about perfection. It's not about, you know, overnight transformation as if you're suddenly going to become a totally different being. You're still going to be you with all of everything that brought you to this point, but you can move forward, and you don't have to load yourself with a sense of moral failure on top of everything else that you might be struggling to deal with.
Exactly. And even those, you know, quote unquote bad or regretful choices weren't because you're a bad person or a weak person. You were doing the best you could to help yourself in that situation. It's just that you didn't really have very many tools. You know, or all the information that you needed to make what was a more supportive decision for yourself. So I just want to leave all of that at the door, basically, and just like where anyone's coming into this conversation, completely welcomed and completely it's only up from here.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Saint Oprah of Winfrey says, now you know better, you can do better.
Right. Exactly.
Absolutely. So Ruby, let's talk a bit more about your book. So you've got this new book coming out, Sober Curious Reset. It's out right now in the States. It's available for pre-order in the UK. That's right.
Yes. It was due to be here today in the UK, but shipping problems, understandably, I suppose, mean it'll be actually available the 29th of December, but you can pre-order it now, which means you should receive your copy on the 29th of December. So as we say, available wherever books are sold.
So for anyone who's thinking about a book to support themselves in their next change of changing their drinking, could you tell us kind of in broad summary why somebody should choose Sober Curious Reset? What's it going to give them, and what kind of process is it going to take them through?
Well, like I said, it's you know, the subhead Change the Way You Drink in 100 Days or Less, but then it also has a kind of a reading line at the top, which is a workbook and self-study guide. So you might be engaging in other Quitlet, you might have like other practices that you're sort of thinking about, but this is a place, and it actually is sort of like a journal that has blank pages in it that you can write in as well. So it can really become your companion to all of the work you're doing around being sober curious for that 100-day period. And so, it's super interactive. I kind of wanted it to feel like you actually have a coach kind of with you by your side in this book. I write in a very, very conversational kind of way, and lots of people often comment that particularly when they've listened to my audiobooks, they're like, I really know you. I just feel like I've had a really long conversation with you. So it's designed to be a kind of a real guide. And it's very, you know, there's a paid, like a snippet of info to read every day. And then I suggest about 20 minutes or so to kind of engage with the different exercise. But it's not like you have to commit to hours a day to kind of read it. It's very accessible in that way. I would recommend, if you're called to read Sober Curious, like the original Sober Curious book, in addition, maybe at the beginning, because it sets up a lot of the philosophy and can set a lot of the thought processes in motion. But again, that's a pretty quick, easy read. And then I will also say, I love reading novels. That's one of what, like, oftentimes when I wanted a drink, it's because I wanted to just switch off from the world and shut down my thinking mind and kind of shut off the work day. And I just love reading novels. So like, people are often like, what's your favorite Quitlet, or what self-help books are you reading? I'm like, I don't really read many myself. I read novels because that feels transportive and escapist, but in a really healthy way, you know?
Yeah, I was really excited to discover this year that the category of books which I enjoy is a category, and it's called creative nonfiction. I didn't realize that that's what I
Cool.
was reading all of this time. But people who, whether it's natural history or travel or biography, people who tell stories about real world things.
Very
It's a
cool.
category called creative nonfiction, and I didn't realize. And that is absolutely my escape. Much like novels are for you.
Mhm.
One of the questions that we get asked a lot in the Club Soda community, I find myself writing about this subject all the time, and it's one that you tackle head on day 31 of your book. Going to test your memory of your contents now. Right, I'll tell you what it is. Is it okay to moderate?
Oh, oh.
So I answer this question all the time. So I should say, for context, I drink very occasionally. I have had 4 drinks of alcohol this year. That's what my moderation looks like, just by way of context. So I know that moderation is possible and people do it, but it's something that people ask all the time. And I wonder, could you share your thoughts on that subject?
It's so tricky. And it's interesting, what you just described as moderation is not what I think most people think of when they're thinking, can I moderate my drinking?
I
Can
realize
I
that, yeah.
drink on Friday night? Or can I only ever have 2 drinks? Or can I only ever drink beer? And will that be how I work all of this out? I think when I said I'm not sober, I guess by your standards, I also moderate. I've had 2 drinks of alcohol in the past year, right? One was literally, I think, December 23rd. Last year, and one was sort of in the summer this year. And I won't go into the details of why I chose to have a drink in those situations, but it's another reason I don't call myself sober, and I use sober curious instead. But I wouldn't consider that moderating, because like I said, I think that moderating, it has this, for me, the word, it's sort of like already sets up, right, I'm going to try and control this. I'm going to take control. Impossible. I think it's kind of, if you're thinking about, I'm going to control my relationship with alcohol, it means that there's probably a good reason to stop and take a really, really extensive break. That said, so I don't advise, for anyone who wants to really change their drinking habits, I don't advise moderation. I'm like, you need a period of abstinence. I would recommend minimum 100 days, try 6 months, try a year, and then question. Only when you've been through a long, long period of not drinking, then question, what role would I like alcohol to have in my life? Because you'll have a very different perspective than if you're going into it with, I'm drinking every night, that feels like too much, I should try and moderate.
Yeah.
Alcohol is in control of you still at that point. You need to like get alcohol out of your life and then decide, do I want to bring this back in?
Yeah.
And I think you'll find that your answer is very, very different to what you might expect it to be if you're still in the grips of like a regular drinking habit, So do I think it's possible? Yes, because I guess I could say I do it. Yes, it's possible, but I don't think that you can just kind of like skip from I'm drinking too much to I'm going to moderate. I think you need to have that big, long break in between.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that perspective is really important. I know the big mind shift that happened for me a couple of years ago was when I realized that and this was even when I'd significantly cut back with drinking, is when I realized that not drinking was my norm. This is how I live my life. My life generally doesn't involve alcohol. So now my thinking about drinking is that I'll only have a drink on those occasions where alcohol adds value.
Right.
To a situation or to an event. It's not compensating for the loss of something. It's not an automatic routine. It's something which is, very conscious and very deliberate and thought out in advance. And it's only ever one drink. That's in part because, you also discover after long periods of sobriety that you are lightweight. It's just like half a shandy and I'm anyone's. I'm a super cheap date. But I think that's the mindset shift. If you are, and I think you're right. I think there may be other routes to get there, but I think if you are somebody who is struggling to cut down, there is an underlying question there, which is what's going on that you feel that this isn't a thing that you can step away from completely?
Exactly.
In what way is it holding on to you, and how can you find a path which doesn't center around drinking as your only option? Ultimately, for me, all of this is about, you know, having better choices, whether it's about drinks that you have, or dealing with emotional states, or overcoming stress, or getting a better night's sleep. Is what are the range of choices that you have? And very often when we get tangled up in drinking, alcohol becomes our only option.
Feels like
So
the
it's
option.
so it's about finding other choices and having confidence to be able to take them, I think.
Exactly, I completely agree. But and like I said, I think it involves, you might think that, well, a drink's going to add something anytime I'm at a party, but you'll only know that that's not the truth if you go to lots of parties and don't drink.
Yeah.
The only way you can actually truly know the answer to that question, or know whether that's true for you, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Ruby, thank you so much for this conversation and for joining us this evening. This has been
meeting you.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. So your book, just to remind people, if you're looking for a present for somebody, if you're in the States right now, you could get it for somebody as a Christmas gift, or if you're looking for a book for yourself for the new year, and you're thinking about changing your drinking, Ruby's book is called The Sober Curious Reset: Change the Way You Drink in 100 Days or Less. It's available now in the US, available for pre-order in the UK. Ruby, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dru. This has been great.
Brilliant.